Welcome to this edition of the News Review. In this edition, fighting intensifies between Russian and Ukrainian forces for control of the town of Soledar in eastern Donetsk region. Ukraine says it is resisting, quote, high-intensity Russian offensive. It also says that the Russian military has relocated main forces to the Donetsk front. Ukraine says it is a difficult phase of the war, but its forces are holding out in Soledar. The forces on Wednesday said that they were in control of the key town. Russia, however, urged caution and reported advances. Ukrainian officials say more than 500 civilians remain trapped in Soledar as fighting goes on. Another development, Russia has said that Belarus may enter the Ukraine conflict if Kiev invades their country. Also, Russia is saying that it has completed the liberation of the city of Soledar in eastern Ukraine. Now, this is some breaking news that we just received from the war. Ukraine's defense minister, in the meantime, says that his country has become, in his words, a de facto member of the NATO military alliance. He says that is because Ukraine is receiving Western weaponry and knows how to use them. He also said that the West will certainly provide Ukraine with the weapons it has long been seeking. He added that the country will also become a member of NATO by law in the near future. The Ukrainian defense minister made the comments in an interview with the BBC. Ukraine officially submitted its bid to join NATO soon after Russia launched its war in February 2022. Russia is strongly opposed to the membership. Moscow sees NATO's eastward expansion as a threat to its security. Earlier this week, the Russian security official said that his country is in fact fighting NATO and the West and not Ukraine, as they continue to give arms to Kiev. Now, to continue that discussion, we're joined by our correspondent Johnny Miller, who is located in Crimea, and also we have with us John Bosnich, journalist, activist, and political analyst, joining us live from Belgrade. Thank you very much to both of you. Let's begin with our correspondent Johnny. We just received some breaking news that Russia announced that it has liberated the Soledar region. If you could please give us more updates on the situation there.
Yes, well, that does seem to be the case. The private military organization Wagner, fighting for the Russian forces, captured Soledar. We've seen images of their soldiers on the streets. This is a strategically important settlement. It opens the way to take Bakhmut. The Russians have been trying for months to take Bakhmut, but now we're seeing some of the most fierce fighting of the war so far as the Russians try to succeed there. Dozens, probably hundreds of soldiers being killed or wounded every day right now. There's also been talks for weeks of the potential of another front opening up, another major offensive being launched by the Russians, a big build.
Well, it seems that we have some technical difficulties. We've lost connection with Johnny Miller. So let's continue this with Mr. John Bosnich. We heard the Ukrainian official practically stating that NATO has accepted Ukraine as a de facto member. The sign and testimony to that is the weapons that are being used in Ukraine, with Ukrainian soldiers actually being able to use them, being trained to use those weapons. What does this signify, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, the entire presentation by the Ukrainian defense minister is actually nothing more than propaganda. Point number one, NATO membership can only be decided by a unanimous vote of all current members of NATO. That means all of the countries in Europe which are members of NATO, and Canada and the United States. We already know that Hungary has said that it has no interest in widening this war and expanding the war. We're expecting easily a veto, in other words, non-agreement to Ukrainian membership from Hungary. There are other possible countries which would say the same thing. I do not think that there is any possibility, in other words, zero possibility of a unanimous NATO vote to accept Ukraine. Number two, when a country is accepted as a member of NATO, its primary requirement is that it has sovereignty over its own territory. At the current time, Russia has claimed and annexed 4 provinces, which were formerly part of Ukraine, but Ukraine does not recognize those territories as a part of Russia, which means that Ukraine itself states that it does not have sovereign control over its own territory, which means it's not eligible for membership in NATO. If we take that a step further, if NATO were to violate its own charter, if it were to force the membership of Ukraine against the wishes of Hungary and probably result in Hungary leaving NATO, and if Ukraine then became a NATO state, that would mean that NATO would automatically be in a state of war. That means Canada would be at war, America would be at war, England would be at war, France would be at war, Italy would be at war, in a declared war, because the territory of the country that they recognize as Ukraine is currently occupied and held by Russian troops and actually populated by Russian citizens. So the entire prospect is ridiculous, and it makes no sense except as a piece of propaganda. So I would suggest that the Minister of Defense of Ukraine change his title from Minister of Defense to Minister of Propaganda.
That was very interesting. Let's bring Johnny Miller back with his smile on the face. And Johnny, it seems that you agree with Mr. Bosnich. Give us more updates on the situation there and the points that Mr. Bosnich just mentioned.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure when you lost me before, but I was just talking about the possibility of another front opening up. There's been speculations of the Russians opening up another front, a big build-up in Belarus. It's not clear whether this large offensive will happen or whether it's just a ruse by the Russians to draw Ukrainian forces away from Donbass. Donbass, the major primary objective for the Russians at the moment. But it looks like there's going to be grinding warfare there for many more weeks or months. In terms of what Mr. Bosnich was saying, there is a great fear here that this war will only escalate this year. People talking about the beginning of World War III, etc. And there is a real danger of that, especially as NATO and Ukraine keep talking about wanting to take back Crimea. I'm in Crimea right now. It seems very unlikely that Ukraine is going to be able to take back Crimea unless NATO gives even more help. And if the more help that NATO gives, the greater risk there is between an open war between Russia and NATO. So 2023, there's very little prospect, very little talk about peace anymore. The Russians, I think, have lost all faith in Ukraine and NATO of negotiating for peace, and so they're very much concentrated on the battlefront. So right now and the coming months, proving increasingly dangerous, not just for Ukrainians, but the threat of a wider war.
So, Mr. Bosnich, you did mention that this is just a piece of propaganda. Who is it aimed at?
Well, there are always multiple targets of propaganda. Of course, the first piece of propaganda is aimed at the Ukrainian people themselves, because they're seeing their sons being sent off to a slaughterhouse in which they're outgunned, outfought, and outmaneuvered by the much larger, much superior Russian army, which has only deployed a tiny fraction of its troops. As Russia's major mobilization that's currently underway gets onto the battlefield, what we called a slaughterhouse up until now is going to turn into a bloodbath. There is no chance that the Ukrainian military can defeat the Russian military. The Ukrainians know that, the Ukrainian soldiers know that, the Ukrainian people know that. So what we've got here is an effort to jump over the normal democratic controls of military force. In a democratic country, the decision to go to war is always made by the democratically elected officials and by the parliament. In the case of the sudden absorption of the rump state, because it doesn't control its own territory, but of the rump state of Ukraine into the Western military aggressive alliance, that means that they are automatically, immediately at war, which means that martial law will have been imposed in Canada, the United States, France, Italy, Germany, and so on, because no parliament will have the chance to vote on being at war, because they will be at war already. And this is where the word de facto comes into play. De jure refers to the legal state, but de facto is the situation on the ground. Well, right now, the HIMARS, the much taunted HIMARS guns, artillery that Russia is eliminating one after another, are all 100% being run by US officers. The targeting of all 100% of Ukraine's rockets and missiles are being run by US and other NATO officers. And the training of the troops is being run by Canadian and other officers, because I've spoken with them myself. This is a proxy war in which the Ukrainian people are the cannon fodder, and the sooner they figure out that they're being used, the sooner they can find their way to peace, if that is actually their objective.
And Johnny Miller, just to wrap this up, do you see any prospects for peace or negotiations at this point?
Yeah, there seems to be very little prospects for peace at the moment. The Russians are concentrated on winning on the battlefield, and NATO are making clear that the only way that there will be peace is to send more weapons to Ukraine. I'll also just end by saying that Noam Chomsky and John Pilger, two great speakers, academics or journalists, have said they've never seen the level of propaganda that they have seen from NATO countries in this war. Because there's an attempt to persuade European people that this war is winnable by NATO on the ground, and it seems very unlikely that it will be. Ultimately, there will be peace negotiations. The sooner that starts to happen, the better. But right now, it seems the slaughter that's going on in Bakhmut, dozens, hundreds of soldiers being killed or wounded every day, that's the reality right now as we speak. It looks like that's going to continue for the coming weeks and months.
Thank you very much. Our correspondent Johnny Miller live from Crimea, and Mr. John Bosnish, journalist, activist, and political analyst from Belgrade. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and views with us on this edition of the News Review. And thanks to all of you viewers for watching this edition.